Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 4th, 2021, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm going to do a couple things right now. One of the first ones is a little conversation about someone we lost in my community that actually was a friend, a neighbor, had impact in ways that's hard to describe. And I desperately wish the members of this body could have spent time with him and his wife. Reverend Dr. Professor C.T. Wright. What was so unique about him is he was a big man. He had a voice that carried, and you would actually have conversations with him and realize just how incredibly brilliant he was. He was born in Georgia. He struggled and worked his way up. He ended up with a PhD in history from Boston College. He became a civil rights leader. And yet when you would talk to him about that, Reverend Wright, Dr. Wright, actually often wouldn't refer to himself as a civil rights leader. He would say, I want to lead for humanity. He loved people. It was a different view. He actually took his struggles and his success and his academic prowess and said, we're going to make people's lives better. Why would you dare focus on the color of their skin? I remember one of the most interesting conversations I had with him where he and I were in the back of the room and talked, and he actually saw actually almost an example of what we just saw on the floor, the discussions of politics and race, and saying, David, it's class, it's opportunity that divides us. It's not our color, it's our opportunity. Dr. Wright was just a powerful, brilliant man. And you see his wife there, Mary. They were married in 1974. Mary was the epitome of love. I mean, how many of us in our lives have that one person where your little girl, I'm blessed to have a 5-year-old, but even when she was younger, she would see Mary, Mary would sort of scream, and the two of them would run over and hug each other. Just the epitome of love. And that they made them incredibly powerful as you felt good by just knowing Dr. Wright and Mary Wright in your community. The other thing it also made him unique, he was a passionate conservative. He was a Republican elector. He was the chairman of our clemency board. He was on my community school board. He was brilliant. He cared about humanity. He ran charities and foundations to help all people, to help people in the continent of Africa, but even people all through our community. And he was a powerful force for good because he was good, because he was passionate, because he was caring. And we've lost both Mary and Dr. Wright last year. I'm going to put in a much more detailed, because his CV, his history goes on page after page, and we'll put that in the congressional record. But it's individuals like this that bring us together, but also make us better. And it breaks my heart that more will not actually get to spend time with him, because both he and Mary, after a couple minutes with him, you felt different. And the last thing I will say, he loved to give the opening prayer at Republican meetings. And what was always so fascinating is you'd watch the room, and the room ends up standing up, clapping, and I was waiting for an altar call. Now, I'm Catholic, so I'm not used to the concept of an altar call. But watching someone be able to have such energy and vigor and enthusiasm and love for people and love for believing that conservatism is actually how you free people. He made an impact, and made an impact on my life, my family's life, my community, my state, and I believe he made an impact on this country. Madam Speaker, I wanted to do a handful of other things because, with the craziness of our schedule, we haven't had a chance to sort of walk through a lot of policy thoughts. But there was one that's been bugging me. So I have the hour, so I was going to share something that's just been in my craw for a while. Do we all remember a few years ago, ancient history? In politics, we seem to have the, shall we say, the attention span of a gnat. One of the pop culture debates we on the right and the left were having was something called net neutrality. The Democrats were all into net neutrality, even though I will debate most of this body had no idea what actual net neutrality was. And I want to sort of argue that thank heaven, thank the internet gods, that the Democrats' net neutrality push only lasted 1 year, or think about how miserable this last year would have been. We should be held accountable for our policy beliefs. And this is an occasion where I've heard no one get up here and talk about what society would have looked like in the United States during the pandemic if the Democrats' net neutrality policies, and remember, they did it for 1 year through fiat, through regulatory. The only reason I showed up this chart is, do you see the crash here in spending? And it was scheduled to continue to crash in spending. That spending was the internet, the pipes, the robustness, the speed, the carrying capacity of the internet crashed during the Democratic administrations, the FCC's 1 year of functionally doing an through administrative fiat net neutrality. If that line had continued, how many of you were educating your kids on Zoom? How many of you were holding meetings on the internet? How many of you had to work from home? How many of us in this body were doing committee hearings over the internet? Yet, the internet in the United States in 2017, 18, and 19 actually got dramatically more robust, dramatically faster. In many of the communities, particularly on the East Coast, oddly enough, there's communities that doubled their speed, the robustness of the pipes. And it happened because of the massive investment, because, thank heaven, the crazy policy of what was net neutrality was taken away. We need to be honest. Sometimes being willing to walk up and admit, hey, that was a really stupid idea. The one reason this country was able to have its disruption and transfer to basically a knowledge-based, web-based, internet-based economy was because the crazy policies that net neutrality were driving into being able to have a robust internet only lasted 1 year. And you can actually see, this is what happened. This is us. This is America trying to survive economically and educationally. When you see these charts, this was not possible if that trend, regulatorily and then therefore investment-wise, that started in 2016 when the policy shift happened, if it had lasted more than a year, this year would have been a lot different. It's just an occasion where 4 years ago, 5 years ago, some of us would get up here and try to explain what it would mean to the efficiency, the robustness, the opportunity to even gamers being able to use the internet. And we would get great rhetorical comments back, often having nothing to actually do with how the internet worked. Thank heaven, another bad policy only lasted a short time. The other thing I also want to talk about is why so many of us who actually own calculators are intensely concerned about the left's policy in the last couple months. And this is one of those, I genuinely believe both sides here passionately care of wanting society to do well, to have opportunity, the working poor to become less poor, the poor to become less poor, the middle class to be able to thrive. But we just see the basics of economics differently. And I want to spend just a couple moments and walk through what is fact, and we have the fact. Now, first off, how many times over and over and over and over and over do we hear, hey, post-tax reform, the rich were getting richer, poor were getting poorer? You know that's mathematically absolutely not true. It's a lie. It turns out policies like we've engaged in just recently make the wealthy wealthier. And it's a simple thought. When you pump massive amounts of liquidity into a society, into an economy, those people that own assets get richer. Their stocks go up. Their house values go up. Other assets they have go up. But if you're part of the poor or working poor, how many stocks do you own? How much real estate do you own? But yet the basic economic principles that you get to look at over and over, and the $1.9 trillion spending bill violated almost all the principles. You'd say, okay, so we're going to deliver actual checks, great, okay, that will have an impact for several months. It will reduce poverty for several months, but it doesn't change the base that a year later, are you being paid more? Are there more job opportunities? Is your labor valuable? Because the remarkable thing that happened in 2018 and 2019 is the working poor, their labor became valuable. They became essential to the society, to economic growth. Where I sat through joint economic hearings in previous years, and the arrogance of the economists, the arrogance of the political class, saying, well, they didn't finish high school, they're going to be part of the permanent underclass, we'll just find a way to subsidize them and write them off in society instead of making them valuable. And that's what we've gone back and done again. And the problem is we've done it in a way where we think we have big hearts. Look, we're going to send checks. But what about the year after? Did you make their labor, their skill sets, or the lack of skill sets, did you make them desirable in the economy? So a simple point, and if I actually even had better data, this would even be more dramatic. 2013, 2016. You see the orange there? That's actually pretty much the wealthy in our country. Do you see that under the previous administration, when I say previous, I'm talking Obama, the wealthy got substantially wealthier than the poor. And it's because the lack of understanding of what creates economic vitality. This here is almost solely 2018, 2019. The poor got wealthier. Not the rich, the poor. The working poor moved up dramatically faster than the rich. Why? Well, it turns out tax reform moved lots of capital into making plants and equipment more efficient, meaning you pay people more. Remember, you all remember your basic economics class. What are the two things that raises someone's wages? Inflation, which means you get paid more but you didn't get anything more. Productivity. When you raise a business's, a society's, a community's productivity, people get paid more. That's what was happening here. We made the working poor less poor through tax, regulatory, and something we'll touch on in the end, because it's very uncomfortable for a lot of people to talk about, is actually also immigration policy. Immigration policy is complex from an economic standpoint, but if you love and care for those who are just struggling and trying to survive, they may not have had the opportunity to go to grad school or college, they may not have even graduated high school, but they're out there trying to provide for themselves and their families and the people they love and care for. Why do we adopt policies like this that don't make their labor valuable, and then we choose to flood the market with similar skill sets to devalue their labor? There's this weird duplicity that happens here where we talk about, helping those who need help, and then we engage in policies, whether it be immigration policy, regulatory policy, particularly tax and spending policy, that end up crushing the very people we claim we are trying to help. And look, I know charts are annoying, but the math is the math. If you look at this one, where you start to see percentage of American households that were in poverty, we substantially had plateaued. We weren't getting better as a society. And then all of a sudden, over here, you see when we started doing what was necessary to expand, create opportunity. And yes, it meant getting businesses to have to compete with each other by putting money into more efficient equipment, but by doing things that lifted Americans and created value for labor, even the very low-skilled labor. And you start to see 2018, 19, America hitting its lowest poverty rates ever. Income, food, insecurity, the lowest ever. The working poor's labor became valuable. And if you actually want to go into the subsets, which I have chart after chart after chart, you look at, if you claim you care about African American females or this subset or that subset, you saw some of those subsets have movement in the value of their talents and their labor were remarkable. We had I think, a quarter where in early 2019, or it was late 18, where African American women had almost a double-digit rise in wages. In an entire year, it was like 7.3% rise in wages. I know as a Republican, we have this bad habit of sounding like accountants on steroids. But these numbers really do mean something. It's people. It's how they feed their family, how they save for retirement, how they have an opportunity. There were amazing things happen. So we talk a lot about income inequality, which I actually have a personal fixation on this. And if you actually look at the first time we had major movement in the drop of income inequality in this society, it was 2018, 2019. And it wasn't because rich people got less rich. It's because the poor, the working poor, got dramatically less poor. We adopted policies that made their labor valuable. Then the pandemic hit, and we have to rebuild. But are we rebuilding in a way that makes their labor valuable? And I'm going to make an argument. What we just did is we're going to get a nice little sugar high very short. And then the next day, what are their job prospects? You're someone that didn't finish high school. But you're willing to work your heart out. You're willing to learn. What opportunities did the last spending bill provide for that person? How many new jobs did it help create? How much economic expansion? How much capital expenditure to make their jobs more productive so they can be paid more? Instead, what we did is we said, here's some money. And oh, by the way, we're going to raise some taxes over here coming later this year and those things. So your job prospects are, it's a technical economic term, you're screwed in the future. Do we think more than just the next election cycle? If we're going to make the poor less poor in this country, you need opportunity. We just spent $1.9 trillion and almost not a dime of it creates opportunity. Creates what the future should look like. And so we say we care, we both care. The problem is, I have the numbers that show what worked. The other side has decades of doing the same thing, and income inequality and poverty didn't get better. There's blips, but those blips were from direct cash. So unless the plan is just, hey, we're going to do direct cash forever and ever and ever, and that's going to be really great for society and the psyche of our society. But look, once again, change in house, and I'm sorry to do this, and I hate this term, but it's the only one the economists around here all use, is quartiles. Here's the lowest income quartile. Take a look at 2019. If you're willing to embrace math, I always thought that would be the great Christmas gift around here, is buy everyone a calculator. Family joke is, Daddy works in a math-free zone. It was a remarkable change in the value of those workers and what they were paid. And it's because their talent, their labor that they had to offer became more valuable. Look what happened in 2019. That's what changes a society, because the idea is you build a base, and then the next year you build on it. And then the next year you build on it. And the next year you build on it. That's one way to remove lots of your society out of poverty. The other is to do what the Democrats are doing right now and saying, we're going to send you a check. Okay. What happens the day the check's gone? Did you make society more prosperous? Did you take the working poor of our country and make it so the value of their labor that they offer is more valuable the next day and the next day and the next day? You didn't. The only way you basically have to backfill is you got to send another check. It's societal suicide and lunacy. And look, I understand pandering of politics, but at some point you wish we had a quiet room with some smart economists and say, how do we have a revolution in our society that we have dramatically less poor and the working poor are dramatically less poor, and how do we get there, and how do we do this over the next decade? Because I'll make you the argument, what was happening in particularly 2018, 2019 were remarkable numbers. So let's go to the next quartile up. Turns out the same thing was happening. And when you actually look at the stratification of these quartiles, I'm sorry, it's geeky. Lowest quartile, traditionally very, very low skill set. Second quartile up, some skill set. And you actually see remarkable, I mean, that's a $2,600 increase in the value of their labor for the second quartile, which is still poverty. It's working poor. But this quartile, look at that, that's remarkable. And this is actually with accounting for earning a tax credit and sort of transfer payments, sort of working through what was economic, and it was the value of their labor. Once again, for all of us that keep coming behind these microphones and particularly the darkness of this body right now is we see so much of the debate being about the pigment of someone's skin instead of the economic circumstances, the class, as you might want to, as Dr. Wright would often refer to. And what do we do to create opportunity? And this chart here basically is just pure salary. What happened to the mean weekly real earnings? Now, real earnings, remember, these are inflation adjusted. So I do my best to make sure the math looks is as honest as possible. And when you actually start to see the quartiles of African American wages taking a huge spike up in 2018, 2019, Anglos, Hispanics, really, the growth rate in their wages was remarkable. And there's some other charts which are really hard to read that are a little geeky that start to show saying, okay, and here's the level of skill set, education attainment, those things. Turns out we had such a robust economy that those who are often at the tail end of the educational attainment actually had the fastest growth in wages. And so you go back to the earlier chart saying, turns out the working poor got substantially less poor. The rich got richer, but nothing at the same percentages. And that's why the income inequality shrank. That's the honest math. Yet you don't hear it in the rhetoric here, because the rhetorical divide of our society is so much more powerful, desired, because it's about winning the next election, than actually doing what's important to make society great. So right now, this is a hard one to talk about, because we've so politicized it that trying to look at it through an economic lens is really hard. And I will get folks, whenever I start to walk through these numbers, will send me in crazy stuffs. And you're trying to say, this isn't about ethnicity. It's not, it's just, I'm doing labor economics. You know, Janet Yellen is supposed to be, you know, a brilliant labor economist. Yet, when you hear her speeches recently, or well, now that she's Treasury Secretary, it rips your heart out, saying, at least take a breath and compliment what happened in the previous couple of years. But that would mean saying something nice to free market economics. So right now, we estimate, and this is the best number I can get my hands on, that about 4.5% of the labor force is undocumented. In a society right now where, if you actually really dive into labor force participation numbers, unemployment is probably double the number we post. You know, people who should be in the labor pool and aren't there. The folks who were the miracle of particularly 2018 and 2019, the number of folks who came back into the labor force. Remember, we actually had some quarters there with some weird numbers where unemployment actually sort of flatlined, but the number of workers in the United States exploded. How does that happen? It means you have such a robust economy that you're drawing people back in. The crisis we live today is so many Americans, particularly female workers, are now out of the labor force with almost no intention of coming back in. And what's devastating about that is we just passed legislation here that will reinforce the incentive not to come back in. Because instead of designing the Democrats' $1.9 trillion spending bill of saying, we're going to incentivize, we're going to help you, you can keep some of this money, and we're going to incentivize an employer to hire you. Building that type of economy, it's here's something you can have if you work, you can have it if you choose to just stay home. There's no incentive there to come back into the labor market. And why is this so darn important? Why do I fixate on this? Post-tax reform, if you actually looked at the changes in revenues, remember, we had the second and third highest, adjusted for inflation, tax receipts in U.S. history post-tax reform, post the lower rates. And it's because the economy, the pie, got so much bigger. But what was so special about that is the trust funds that so many of us had worked on that we were really worried how fast the Medicare trust fund was collapsing, the Social Security trust fund was collapsing. The life of them, the actuarial life, popped. It got longer, and it was because we had so many more workers who were paying into it. Remember, we have a pay-as-you-go system. When you hear the word trust fund, there's really very little cash in those trust funds. If you care about protecting Social Security, if you care about protecting Medicare, if you care about society and these promises we've made, you would think the economics, the policy we're adopting here, are about maximizing opportunity and employment, not trying to patch over pain that we're suffering right now in a way that makes the next day painful again. So the last thing, and this is, it actually does tie in, and I'm going to personalize this a little bit. I'm blessed to live in a community where my school's open. the greatest gift that's ever been given to me in my life, and my wife, is we have a little girl. And many know we struggled for years and we're able to adopt a little girl. It is the greatest joy you can imagine. And she's in higher education now. She's in kindergarten. And this summer, for her first month, this is back in August, she had to sit at home behind a little laptop doing Zoom class as a kindergartner. And at that time, she was 4 3/4. She tested in early. Yay. And she was miserable. I had a little girl. I didn't know this could happen, that a child that young could be depressed. She was miserable. Daddy, can I go to Washington with you? Daddy, can I go to work with you? Daddy, don't make me sit behind the computer. Daddy, I don't like this. And then after about 3.5 weeks, the school district actually followed the science. Not the politics, they followed the science. Not the teachers' union, they followed the science. And they started letting the little people into school. And they took the proper precautions, and little girl wears a mask, and they sterilize their hands. They follow rational precautions. And within just days, it's like I had a different little girl. She was joyful. She was happy. She announced she had a boyfriend. Daddy's not happy about that. If that's my personal experience, what have we done to our society? What have we done to the next generation? I came here last week and did a series of presentations of what we've done to individuals' future earning power, particularly the categories we were just talking about, the working poor, their future earnings, their future income. We've crushed them because today's success builds on the next. And what happens when you take functionally an entire year away from so many people's career paths, from building their base? Now, this is international, but we came across this, and it's just a sense of well-being of young people, older people from around the world. And we all saw that article from about a month ago, about Las Vegas County and the number of suicides of children. And this one, when you look at it, it's our kids. We've devastated our kids. My fear is we're going to spend decades making up for the schools being closed, the access to nutrition, access to counseling, the access to just human relationships. Why would we ever allow our public policy to do this sort of violence to the health and well-being and psyche of the children that we claim we care about because the teachers' union has a different agenda? I hope we as members, I hope America remembers what happened here. I also hope the next time the left comes with a massive spending bill, they understand how much that money needs to go into repairing the damage we've done to our children, to the next generation, and being willing to recognize that we didn't follow the science, we followed the politics. So with that, Madam Speaker, I wish us all a fine time at home. I hope now the world is getting healthier, we can spend time with our constituents. And maybe when we come back in a couple weeks, we can still be partisan, we can still duke it out, but we actually make policy by rational math instead of the wedge of politics. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pursuant to Section 11.